There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
As a kid, I was fascinated by the idea of cavemen. Of course, all I had to go on were a few poorly produced movies that depicted cavemen battling dinosaurs, which of course never happened. I even owned an early plastic model of a Cro-Magnon man and woman. They were made by the Aurora Model Company, and you can still find those old kits and reissues on eBay. To me, the Cro-Magnon were indistinguishable from the Neanderthals. As far as I knew, they both lived in caves, wore skins of the animals they'd slaughtered, and fought with spears. Years later, I was reintroduced to both the Cro-Magnon and the Neanderthal in the movie Clan of the Cave Bear. In it, Daryl Hannah portrays a Cro-Magnon girl who is orphaned and then raised by a clan of Neanderthals. Here was a new depiction of a Cro-Magnon that didn't fit with my earlier impressions. So flash forward years later, and there is still quite a lot of misconception about who the Cro-Magnon were. Misconceptions which aren't so different than the ones I had. And, spoiler alert, we really don't refer to them as Cro-Magnon anymore. But we'll get to that. First, a little history. And for that, we need to travel to Les Aziz, France, where in 1868, road crews clearing land for a railway station discovered something they didn't quite understand. What they found, nestled at the back of what was called the Cro-Magnon rock shelter, were bones. The crew, at first, thought they were animal bones, until they found the skulls. These skulls were human. Scattered about the remains were flint tools, ornaments, and other objects too old or crudely worked for them to identify. They called in the French paleontologist Louis Latet to investigate. Latet was an expert on prehistory, and when he stepped into the cave, he knew immediately he'd stumbled upon something unusual. 5 bodies, 4 adults, and 1 infant. The ornaments were made up of animal teeth and shells made into necklaces and what appeared to be pendants. Researchers concluded it was a burial site, and that the bodies had been placed there on purpose and the ornaments' positions deliberate. So who were they? Latet recognized them as being uniquely different from the Neanderthal fossils found in Germany 2 years earlier, but were perhaps just as old. Another species, perhaps? So they were given a name, the Cro-Magnon. Now you have to understand that at the time, Charles Darwin's great book on the origin of species was less than 10 years old. This was in 1868. Science was still coming to terms with what it all meant. Scientists themselves were in the early stages of understanding how animals and humans evolved. Old bones and fossils that represented earlier forms were considered primitive examples of creatures we may have evolved from. It was easy to place them in the chain as a subspecies of our own, or perhaps even an entirely different species. The thing was, no one knew. That knowledge wouldn't come until years later, many years later. And until that time, those 5 individuals were representative of primitive cave dwellers known for over a century as the Cro-Magnon. I want to take a moment to talk about the term primitive. I use it here to differentiate it from the term modern. Primitive often implies less advanced or inferior in some way. That is not at all true. The Cro-Magnon were by no means inferior. They were just earlier. They predated us. Since primitive is often used in the scientific literature, I'll continue to do so, but not to imply superiority on our part in any way, shape, or form. Okay, PSA aside, what do we now know? We know this. The Cro-Magnon are not a separate species of hominid. They are us. Our species, Homo sapien, evolved from Homo erectus, or Homo ergaster, depending on which side of the current debate you fall on. And Homo sapiens appeared in the fossil record between 200 and 300,000 years ago. And from there, well, let me allow author Brian Fagan to explain this. This is taken from an interview by Bloomsbury Press promoting the publication of his 2010 book, Cro-Magnon, How the Ice Age Gave Birth to the First Modern Humans.
Over the last 10 years or so, I've spent a lot of time writing about ancient climate change and its impact on human societies. And the logical extension of this was to write a book on these people called the Cro-Magnons, who were the first modern humans, like you and I, Homo sapiens, in Europe. And they arrived there in about 45,000 years ago.
I hope you caught that. The first modern humans to arrive in Europe. This is why we no longer refer to them exclusively as the Cro-Magnon. The more appropriate term of identification, anthropologically speaking, is Early European Modern Humans, or EEMH. I'll continue to use Cro-Magnon here and there in this episode, but just know that they are anatomically modern humans that arrived in Europe around 45,000 years ago. And they shared the continent with our old friends the Neanderthal, who were genetically and anatomically distinct from us. Now, it would have been a strange new world for those early travelers upon arriving in Europe. This was the land of the woolly mammoth, the deer, and the cave bears. To hunt them, they used spears and these cool little spear-throwing tools called the atlatl. They used stone knives, and they lived in caves and huts, and they even made clothes out of woven cloth. The individuals discovered in the Cro-Magnon cave had injuries as well. The adult female even showed signs of having survived a skull fracture. So this also indicates that they cared for one another. This is no surprise considering they also engaged in another activity which we carry on today: the creation and the appreciation of art. One of the most beautiful art forms you'll see in the world today are the cave paintings created by those early Europeans between 20 and 30,000 years ago. In these are depicted multicolored images of animals such as bison, mammoths, and deer, and the pigments used were made up of ground rocks, and their artwork told stories about great hunts and perils and the callousness of nature. The spark of creativity that led them deep into the caves to create murals and figures also inspired them to carve figurines of naked women, now known as Venus figurines. Now, just how far into the distant past this spark to create was lit is up for debate, but some estimates place it as far back as 100,000 years, as evidenced at some sites in Africa, as well as 50,000 years in Europe. Whatever the case may be, the fact remains: the Cro-Magnon were creative, social, and they had the ability to think not only on the world's realities, but also aesthetically of its beauty. Now, there's another question that researchers and scientists have been asking for decades. That question is why? Why leave Africa? If the savannas and the warm climate provided food in the form of plants and animals, then why head north at all? Why not stay where things worked? I'll again turn to Brian Fagan for a possible answer.
Genetics and archaeology both tell us that it was in Africa that modern humans evolved, and then about 73,000 years ago there was an epochal, and I mean epochal, volcanic eruption of Mount Toba in Southeast Asia and Sumatra, which blew a mountain into space, and enormous amounts of ash went up in the atmosphere, and the sulfur content of the atmosphere became so strong that it obscured the sun and literally over much of the world caused a 7-year nuclear winter. The effect in Africa was cooling, and this may have had an effect on the origins of modern humans, but by 60,000 years ago, having risen to the challenge and maybe having developed the fully modern cognitive abilities of humans, they spread out of Africa.
Wow, did you hear that? The eruption at Lake Toba blew a mountain into space. Who knows? Perhaps. But spacebound mountains aside, it is true that the explosion occurred around 75,000 years ago, according to potassium-argon dating. That explosion was 12 times greater than any we know of in recent history. In 1815, Indonesia's Mount Tambora erupted, and the following year is known as the year without a summer, due to the volcanic ash that blew into the atmosphere. Whether or not the eruption of Mount Toba caused the climate of Africa to cool down is disputed by some. There's some indications that the fossil record of the time doesn't indicate any sort of severe changes in climate. It could also be that the climate was already experiencing a cooling trend and the volcano's explosion helped things move along even faster. But the fact does remain, anatomically modern humans left the savannas and journeyed north. But I do want to mention one thing here. They were modern in both the anatomical and genetic sense, with the slight exception of one curious thing: their brains. Here's an interesting case for those evolution buffs out there. A recent article in the Scientific American, which I will link to in the show notes, reports that studies of fossil evidence have revealed that human brains have been shrinking for the past 20,000 years. Our friends in the Cro-Magnon cave support this claim. Using enhanced 3D technology, scientists have been able to create a replica of the male Cro-Magnon's brain, and that replica is called an endocast. Now, if I were to open my skull and try to fit that endocast into my brain case, it wouldn't fit. His brain would be too big, 15 to 20% too big. So, should we be concerned that the human brain might be shrinking? Well, no. Brains consume energy. A lot of energy. Having a smaller brain requires less energy than a large brain. That makes sense. It can also be more efficient than a large brain. It all depends how the brain regions are composed. The cerebellum is a perfect example of this. Our cerebellum is responsible for our motor movements, things such as walking or balancing and even our postures. It's also responsible for our speech. The Cro-Magnon endocast suggests that its cerebellum was smaller than ours. Now, there's a theory that our own domestication has resulted in our brains becoming smaller for the simple fact that we don't need a larger one. We live a lifestyle free from the worries our ancient ancestors had to deal with, and thus we require less brain power. We no longer have to chase a woolly mammoth down with a spear for food. We can just run to the local supermarket or reach for our phone. Our cerebellum has developed, but the rest of our brain has shrunk. And it certainly doesn't mean that our intelligence has dropped, although I could argue that I've offloaded a lot of the data my brain stores into things like Evernote and Dropbox and my favorite to-do and reminder apps. Without those tools, I'd be lost. And also, so much for the images of future humans with large heads to support their extra-large brains, right? But back to the topic at hand and the correction of my younger self's view of the Cro-Magnon. They weren't large-browed, grunting cave dwellers who wore only loincloths and carried around clubs. They were us. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Evolution Talk. I'm Rick Coast, and you can find show notes and source material used for this episode at evolutiontalk.com. I hope your week is going well, and until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.